Afternoon and welcome everyone. We're going to wait about 1 minute as we wait for folks to get in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Thanks so much for joining us. Hello, for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to wait about maybe 30 more seconds to get started and then kick off this great roundtable discussion. Thanks so much for spending your lunch with us. All right, I'm not seeing any new people trickling in right now, so let's get started so we have plenty of time to chat. And we'll bring folks into the discussion as they come in. So good afternoon again. My name is Brittany Whitley. I'm the Executive Director at Most Policy Initiatives. For those of you who haven't worked with us before, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based here in Central Missouri. We were founded by 3 University of Missouri graduate students, and our goal is really to provide nonpartisan evidence-based information for our state and local decision makers. So really thinking about ways we can bring together experts from across sectors to help solve complicated problems using kind of this fundamental shared basis of understanding. We're also really excited to co-host this series of conversations with the WashU Climate Change Program. So let me turn it over to Alex to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Alex Morales-Heil, and I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator here at Washington University in St. Louis. And in our program, we draw together faculty, students, administrators, and community colleagues across disciplines to promote climate action and to serve as an interdisciplinary resource for climate research and curriculum. We strive to develop collaborations and prepare leaders for tomorrow. So we are really excited to be here partnering with you today, Brittany.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. So we're going to get this kicked off. A few housekeeping things just in case. If you're joining us, if you would please mute your microphone so that we can hear our speakers. We would love to hear questions from you though throughout. And so if you have questions, please add those to the chat whenever you have them. We'll do our best to have panelists respond in real time if they're able. And then if not, we'll kind of pose those towards the end. So if you hear something and you want to learn more, please add that to the chat so we can make sure we're covering what y'all are most interested in. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest moderator for today. We are so excited to have Hannah Hemmelgarn from the MU Center for Agroforestry. Man, I messed that one up. Hannah is the Assistant Program Director at the MU Center for Agroforestry. And we're really fortunate. Hannah's been able to work with all of our panelists in some capacity before. Really excited for this group to have this conversation today. So with that, let me turn it over to Hannah to introduce our panelists and get the conversation started. Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you, Brittany and Alex, for putting this together, and all the panelists for being here. Like Brittany said, we know each other, and I think these are conversations that we're glad to have in this kind of public space, especially at this important time. So remember to vote if you haven't already today. So I'll just very briefly mention who our panelists are. They all wear multiple hats and do so much. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg. But their titles, their current titles, Dr. Rob Myers is the director of the University of Missouri's Center for Regenerative Agriculture. Molly Ruckaman is the founder and CEO of Earth Dance Organic Farm School in Ferguson, Missouri. And Dr. Sugata Bardhan is an assistant professor of natural resource management at Lincoln University and has been putting together a really robust forest farming program there. So with that, there's so much more that each of these people could say about what they do. And I think a lot of that is going to come through in the questions that we cover. So I want to just dive right in to the core of what we're talking about and try to get on the same page about what this is, regenerative agriculture. Many of you have probably heard this term used in multiple contexts, maybe with inconsistency. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to describe how you define regenerative agriculture in your own practice on your own farm or organization, and what that means in terms of maybe what regenerative agriculture isn't also. So let's start with Dr. Rob Myers.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, we launched the Center for Regenerative Agriculture about 2.5 years ago at the University of Missouri. At that time, it was only the second such center focusing on regenerative ag at a university in the country. There had been one in California. There's also now one at Michigan State University, and I expect we'll see more over time. So I'm going to start with what it's not, which is a lot of times people ask, is regenerative agriculture the same as sustainable agriculture? Well, I've worked in sustainable agriculture most of my career. First got involved with it way back in the 1980s and served as a national program director for sustainable ag at USDA. And I feel pretty comfortable in saying that regenerative agriculture is something different than sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture is quite broad, as you all know, covering economic, environmental, and social aspects of sustainability in our food and farming systems. And there's no question that regenerative agriculture is also a broad concept. Unlike sustainable ag, where there are some definitions, including a government definition associated with the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, there is no government definition of regenerative ag, nor are there any ones that have been developed that there's common consensus on in terms of like a 1 or 2 sentence definition. However, I would say that, and this is the way we look at it through our Center for Regenerative Ag, there are certain things that most programs working in this topic area have in common. And one of those things is to have an outcomes-based focus. So we often talk about what types of things we're trying to achieve or goals we have with regenerative ag. And I think very common elements you would see are improving the health of the soil or the resiliency of the soil, having more biodiversity in our systems, and not just with more plant biodiversity, but also integration of animals, particularly livestock. And then certainly the climate change factors in a major way to regenerative ag. How do we develop food and ag systems that are resilient to a changing climate? So those are some key outcomes. There are many others we could talk about: water quality, wildlife, farm prosperity, again, social or quality of life factors. But I would say that outcomes-based focus is where we tend to approach it in our center. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. Molly, do you want to follow that up?
Sure. So it's funny because this question to me brings up like the broad lexicon that we have that has been developed over like multiple generations of trying to describe the way that food is produced. And in some ways, actual verbiage for it is not important to me, but in other ways, because it's kind of like, well, what are you actually doing? You know, like we can talk about all this all we want, but what does your farm actually practice, or what type of stewardship practices do you actually live out? On the other hand, like language is important, obviously, and certain terms can mean things, but like you've already mentioned, Hannah, it can mean different things to different people. We would define, or I should say, I would define regenerative agriculture as a holistic approach to food production that does integrate the social aspects as well as the ecological aspects of the land, while simultaneously producing meaningful quantities of food. I don't think that you can really separate the human component. I think that's something that is often forgotten about when we're talking about climate change. Of course, we know that humans are affecting climate change, but how can we also be looking at solutions that are regenerating the people who are the practitioners of this? So we're really at Earth Dance very invested in how do we actually keep our team going, you know, and how do we retain really amazing farmers and provide them the resources that they're then providing to the community. So that's, I guess, the angle I want to offer is like the social piece of it being of primary importance to be truly regenerative.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to that component too, because I think it is often forgotten or left out of when we think about regenerative agriculture, what that is. Thank you, Molly. Dr. Bardhan, can you add to this definition for us?
So my job is really difficult because I have to add to what has already been said. So the only thing I can add is I mean, I agree with everything they have said, and that's what we are trying to do at Lincoln University. And agroforestry is one of the most efficient regenerative methods out there, and it includes forest farming, silvopasture, alley cropping, which are all highly efficient in regenerating already degraded environments. One other thing I will add is how regenerative agriculture can really, and this is a very new field of study, how it relates to human health. Because most of the crops that is grown on lands which are degraded or not highly fertile. I'll give you a small example. Let's talk about riboflavin, B2. So there are 7 steps in which magnesium and zinc are critical in the synthesis of that compound. Now think about if the soil is deficient in these 2 elements, how plants adapt to those conditions. So either it will take up other divalent cations or it will reduce the production of B2. Both of which are bad because those other divalent cations could be toxic to human beings. So along with lifestyle diseases, which we say diabetes, obesity, maybe there is a regenerative agricultural component to human health, which we have started some research on that. So that's something hopefully I could add to what they have already said, which encompassed everything.
Thank you so much for that addition. All right, well, so since this is a policy conversation in addition to an agricultural conversation, and so often the two are intimately entwined, I want to also dig a little bit deeper on this question and think about why these definitions matter, and if there are any concerns you have about the fact that we might all have a different definition for regenerative agriculture and what that might look like into the future, especially in the policy context. And any of you can chime in to get this started.
Well, I'll go ahead, I guess. So we did see in the early days of sustainable agriculture, I'm talking the late 1980s and the early 1990s, kind of a similar path in that there was a lot of people saying, well, what is sustainable agriculture? What does it mean? And how do we formalize it? And so I kind of lived through some of that process. I was working in Washington, D.C. at the time, initially on Capitol Hill, and then later at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I would say, kind of like what Molly was saying, that maybe it's not so important right now that we have an exact definition, but that we have some shared language around what we're trying to achieve and some shared vision and goals for how we're going to get there. I think that this space is going to continue to evolve. Where there is some challenge right now from a policy perspective is, there are some groups that say, well, we need to have labeling that helps consumers know which foods are being grown in a certain way. Obviously, we've had a variety of labels to date. We've had, as everyone knows, organic labels. We've had GMO-free labels, other types of labels out there. And I hear from a lot of people, they feel that if we keep adding more food labels, it just gets too confusing for consumers. So I personally am a little cautious of going that route, at least at the moment. Not that there can't be particular things or products that have a regenerative label, but I think to me, it is just kind of continuing to communicate with each other, including policymakers, about what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. I'm going to go back to that. So if we're trying to achieve more soil health, more biodiversity, more resiliency, what is it going to take to get there? So I think that's the key thing from a policy standpoint. And I will tell you, with the Farm Bill, that's kind of the way a lot of the people working on the Farm Bill right now are talking. They're more, okay, well, let's not get too hung up on whether this is the regenerative ag Farm Bill. Let's just talk about the things we want to get more farmers able to do out in the landscape.
I really appreciate that mindset, Rob, because I feel like I'm probably one of those people who feels like is what we need is really another label. Like I know that Rodale has spearheaded the effort of pioneering a new certification process, and it's regenerative organic, and you at the minimum have to meet the certified organic standards. Well, unfortunately, that was born out of frustration from a lot of soil-based organic farmers. I would put Earth Dance in that category. We're certainly soil-based and believe in soil-based organic farming. But farmers who were frustrated when hydroponics were allowed to get the National Organic seal on their products, even though they were not grown in living soil. It was just the fact that it was not using prohibited substances. And so, and that's, you know, to me, an example of why it would be a better use of our time, perhaps, to maintain the integrity of things that the general public is already familiar with, like the organic seal, than it would be useful to try to go a whole new route. And I mean, I believe that consumers are very smart. So I'm not at all of the opinion that, you know, oh, it's too confusing for people. But, you know, people have a lot on their minds, and it's not so much that they're not smart enough to understand the difference if they have the time to get educated. And I think, you know, there's a lot of forms of poverty, and one of the greatest forms of poverty for everybody, I think, these days is the poverty of time. And I think that the poverty of attention. And I just would like for us to be able to, you know, expend our efforts towards actually growing food in an ecological way, regardless of whatever we call that. So I feel like to the degree that we can channel our policy efforts on some unified fronts, like what you're talking about, Rob, which is like, let's not get hung up in like labeling things, but let's just actually work on getting the outcomes to happen that we want to happen in the next farm bill. Yeah, I could go on about that, but I want to share the space. Thank you for bringing that up, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, again, being the last, I don't want to take up too much time on that. You both covered everything. So just getting things in motion is probably what we should be focused on, bringing people together and making connections and all that.
I mentioned to Alex before this panel that we could talk for hours and hours and hours about these topics, and I would so love to go a little bit farther on this and in thinking about what does that look like in the Farm Bill. And I think you all have brought up really important points with that. But you know, to your points, Molly and Rob and Sugata too, there are these different metrics, these different standards that farmers hold themselves accountable to, whether that's an intrinsic motivation to be doing whatever your, you know, right thing standard is. And having these labels and definitions can help consumers when it's clearly, you know, and accessible to understand what they're buying, what they're supporting. And so Molly mentioned the regenerative agriculture certification program from Rodale. And I want to tie that into the discussion about the social component, because that is a standard that includes reference to economic stability and fairness for farmers, ranchers, and workers as part of that, the requirement. So Molly, you know, you mentioned the regenerative nature of bringing more people into this community. What else does that look like? Where is regenerative agriculture showing up for issues of equity and justice and accessibility? And I think this also ties to one of the questions in the chat about where regenerative agriculture can also potentially become politically charged. So I would love to hear all of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is a big question. And I also think it relates to Hannah's question about whether regenerative agriculture is related to permaculture. So there's a lot of folks who, and permaculture, for folks who may not be as familiar with the term, is it's actually the combination of the words permanent culture. And the idea being that let's design human cultures in such a way that they can be permanently sustainable, or in other words, regenerative. So I think that the two are very closely tied. I think the some of the pushback I've experienced and heard with regards to, I would say, both the terms permaculture and regenerative farming, is that it does feel like it's just white people's new language for practices that have been carried out over millennia, and I think that while I don't want to broad stroke the farming practices of Indigenous peoples, because I think, yes, I'm sure some were highly regenerative and I'm sure some were not. They didn't have, people from thousands of years ago didn't have the information that we have now in terms of like what certain practices do. But they were people who lived much more closely with the land and with nature, certainly were much more attuned and responsible for, the outcomes of their, like, felt the implications of their outcomes, and also were much more responsible to as part of their way of life, and so I do think that I want to be really cautious, and that's partly why I'm like, it doesn't matter what we call it, because if it feels like a way of like taking advantage of practices that others may have used for a long time, how useful is that versus just like uplifting the practices that certain people in different cultures have actually like used as their way of sustaining themselves and their communities for decades. So yeah, a way that this intersects most recently with my work in policy is that I'm part of a really amazing organization called the National Young Farmers Coalition that's actually put on a land access fellowship program that I'm very fortunate to be a part of. It's 100 young farmers from around the country that are working towards more equitable land access in the next farm bill, because it's the number one. Thanks, Alex. Great link drop in the chat if you missed that. Youngfarmers.org if you're on your phone and can't see the chat. So it's a really amazing initiative that's really aiming to prioritize access to farmland being the number one issue for young farmers. And I think that that's a really important social issue that we can't look past when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, because a lot of folks who would love to utilize these principles and practices simply don't have access to land on which to employ them, and so I think that it's why I'm particularly, also grateful to Rob Myers and the Center for Regenerative Agriculture out of University of Missouri for acknowledging the importance of people working with less access to land. And when you're looking at climate smart growing practices, that if we're only going to incentivize people who already own land, that may be like furthering the divide between the haves and the have-nots, if you will, for lack of a better way of saying it. So there are special allowances. I know that this, and I'm kind of like, I guess, segueing into something you can talk about if you want, Rob, the Climate Smart partnership, because I think it's really awesome that you're going to make sure that urban farmers in particular have access to some of these incentives to apply climate smart and regenerative farming practices to land that they may not own yet.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat to this new $25 million project, which is called the Missouri Circle Project, Circle standing for Climate Resilient Crop and Livestock Project. And as Molly was alluding to, we'll have opportunities for 100 or more small farmers to receive funding to implement 3 or more practices that would be ones that contribute to climate change resiliency on their farms. And we wanted to make that very flexible, acknowledging that there's just a huge diversity of small farms in Missouri, obviously everything from vegetable and fruit to herbs to forest farms to a wide variety of livestock operations, and many of them integrated with food production crops. So we're hopeful that this will be a different way of supporting smaller farmers that are trying to do these practices instead of the more typical conservation payments that are per acre. And if you've only got a quarter-acre urban farm, that's not very helpful to get a $50 per acre payment on a quarter acre. So yeah, we're excited about this, and we're still developing the specifics of the projects, but we're launching that project. It's a 5-year effort for $25 million this month, and we'll be looking to do a lot of innovative things across Missouri with it, including with Earth Dance and Lincoln University and the Center for Agroforestry.
So if I may add a couple of things, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said. One of the most important things for Lincoln is, I mean, our stakeholders are small farmers, and if you look worldwide, 80 to 85% of farmlands are classified as small farmers. So regenerative agriculture, climate change, although these we are talking in the Midwest, I mean, these are truly global issues. So because, I mean, when things go up in the atmosphere, they circle around. So we cannot be doing something here in Missouri and hope that someone else. So there is that component to it. So working with small farmers worldwide is really important, where we can have a lot of impact. But at the same time, when we talk about policy issues, I mean, we know many of our modern day agriculture is large farms industrial operation, and their consumers can really push them to be more regenerative and sustainable through advocacy. And that's where universities and nonprofits can really help educate the general public and other consumers to talk to their senators and legislators and policymakers, so that I mean, eventually the pressure is on big farm on how they can also adopt some of these regenerative practices in their operation, with the caveat that we have about expected like 9 billion people that will be on this planet in another 30 to 50 years. So we still need to produce enough food, but at the same time, we have to do a balancing act where we try to reduce the impact of industrial practices as much as possible.
Thank you all for that. And I wanted to highlight too, one of the responses that Rob Myers posted in the chat, that regenerative agriculture is not really a politically charged term at this point. And I think that is in part why we may be seeing so much support for these practices from USDA, that, you know, there's this recognition that this can really benefit everyone, no matter what your starting point is. And I think there was another question, I think from Hannah, a different Hannah in the chat, about what does this really look like on the ground for those of us who are not farmers in the audience here. And I think the link that Rob Myers shared about that Climate Resilient Crops and Livestock Project from Missouri is a great place to look at some examples of what that can look like. But I wanted to also open it up to see if any of you wanted to share just a little bit more about really what it is on the ground, what these practices are. Sugata mentioned agroforestry, of course, but that can be a huge range of practices in and of itself.
Sure. So, I mean, if I may refer to what we have been doing at Lincoln. This past week, we conducted a forest farming workshop, and that came out from my visits with small farmers. So half of their property is often woodlots and unmanaged, which is, again, is not a very sustainable way of maintaining that landscape. So we can work with them, educating them, providing access to these information where they can manage them in a more sustainable way. Also, again, while we are promoting all of this regenerative agriculture, at the end of the day, when you are working with small farmers, you still need to provide them enough income so that they can sustain their livelihood. At the end of the day, money is important. And many of our farmers who we classify small farmers live on less than $50,000 per year for the whole family. So giving that opportunity of extra income from that unused land gives them little bit of flexibility to adopt some of these practices, which will go into their current operation, whether it is using cover crops or goat farming or silvopasture practices. So these are some of the ways we can bring in all the tools that are available to us in helping promote this, because for a producer or a farmer, their bottom line is also important. I mean, if they do not have those resources, it will be difficult to adopt the practices to begin with.
Molly, do you want to add any practices you use at the Earth Dance Farm?
Sure, I can chime in here. So I think a big practice that is really important to the degree possible is to keep something on the ground, growing on the ground at all times. So we would call that living cover instead of leaving any bare soil. Now, sometimes, you know, farmers know that if you're going to direct seed things, you may have a short window of time where you would have the soil bare, especially in such small farming operations like ours, where it's not, we're not using a seed drill and drilling into cover crops. I'm like continually reminded, like, okay, we're not talking probably to a farming audience. So let me try to break down some of these terms. So cover crops are crops that are grown literally like they sound, to cover the ground. They function in a variety of ways, such as they're literally adding organic matter to the soil. So you typically would leave the roots in the ground rather than pulling the crop out. And so the decomposition of those roots is actually building up what's called the organic matter of the soil, like the living stuff of the soil. Another reason why you would grow cover crops is so that you don't have as many weeds, because if you don't grow something, nature will. And so you would just have a really weedy field, which I've experienced before in our early days of farming, where we would just till up ground, and, you know, maybe we wouldn't be able to get in there to plant and form beds because we would have had heavy rains in the spring. And so all of a sudden there's this flush of weeds. And back when we didn't have all the tools and equipment that we have now, it just becomes a weedy mess, and you can't really get in there to do what you need to do. So instead of having a weedy mess, you can actually be intentional about what crops you're growing. And they're distinguished from, I guess you could easily say, cash crops, which are crops that you're actually going to harvest and usually sell or distribute. So cover crops are things, it's kind of a little bit confusing too sometimes, because it's not that certain things that are grown as cover crops aren't ever sold. So for example, daikon radish is a great crop to grow and harvest and cook with and eat, but it's also a really excellent cover crop because those deep, thick tap roots are actually excellent at breaking up compaction in the soil, which is common in Missouri clay soils, and also just common from a lot of tractor work, that you have heavily compacted soils, which leaves like no airspace for air and water to move around in the soil, which is really important for keeping the ecology of the soil alive, the biology alive. So an example of something that can be both a cash crop or a cover crop. Another example would be buckwheat. We like to use that in the summer, in the summertime, because it's a really, I think of it as like sprouts for the soil, like you wouldn't make a meal of of just some like sunflower shoots, but it's a nice nutritious topping. Well, that's the same for buckwheat. It is digested quickly and easily in the summer months, and it grows quickly as well. So those, cover crops is just one, and using no-till, or what we would really be honest and say low till, because there's still little teeny bits of the rows that are tilled as we're going into seed, are ways of keeping living cover on the ground. And yeah, I want to share the space so I could talk more about other methods. Sugata has mentioned forestry. We do employ what I would call agroforestry, or growing a diversity of trees on the farm that are both productive, but also very useful just in terms of the resources that they're providing to the environment. But yeah, I'll turn it over to others.
Well, I think Molly and Sugata have done a good job describing several practices. I would go back to that general goal of trying to get more biodiversity in the agricultural landscape. As we drive across Missouri, you see relatively few things, right? You see a lot of corn and soybeans. You see a lot of pastures that are tall fescue mostly, which is the same grass that's grown in most of our lawns. It's a non-native grass. And with the regenerative idea, we're just trying to get back to more biological diversity in part. That's not the only goal, but we can do that through integration of trees, as Sugata was mentioning, whether that is trees and pastures, what we call silvopasture, or doing alley cropping, where we might plant chestnuts or walnuts in rows with other crops, doing permaculture plantings that use woodies. But we also have other opportunities in our row crop areas, whether they're smaller scale like vegetables or bigger scale like corn and soybeans. As Molly was alluding to, these cover crops are popular. We also see interest in planting pollinators, conservation buffers along the edge of the field to protect streams and other areas of surface waters. And one that I'm kind of excited about is the integration of crops and livestock together. So we're seeing more opportunities to use animals to graze cover crops on land that would otherwise be corn and soybean. We're also seeing farmers that have pasture take part of those pastures and make them more biologically diverse. It could be as simple as seeding clover into a tall fescue pasture, but the thing that's kind of new is there's a big push in Missouri to get native plants used in pastures. Not all pastures, but have some of the pastures have tall grass prairie plants with native forbs. And so that's being pushed through our Missouri Department of Conservation, as well as our Missouri Natural Resources Conservation Service. And my office are working with others to try to offer opportunities in that way as well. So all these things, if we get that greater biological diversity, it's good for the soil, it's good for pollinators, songbirds, wildlife, and just leads to a better overall environment situation for all of us. So lots of practices for sure.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight that there is such diversity in what this can look like, and that's important because every farmer has their own unique needs, their own unique situation, and as has also come up, this accessibility piece, what's going to work for one person may not work for someone else on whatever their landscape looks like. So with that acknowledgement and an acknowledgement of the complexity that these more diversified systems can have, of course, continuous living cover, agroforestry, perennial crops, perennial grains and forages, also requires secure land tenure. So there are so many layers to this. And I know that many of us are working to address some of the barriers. So land access has come up, financial insecurity has come up from Sugata, and the project that Rob Myers is leading at Center for Regenerative Ag, Center for Agroforestry and Lincoln University and Earth Dance are all part of that too. Center for Agroforestry is also part of another project funded by the same program that covers the whole eastern half of the US. So if you're outside of Missouri, these can apply, and there are many other programs through that USDA Climate Smart Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities that are just everywhere and covering all aspects of what we're talking about. So I just want to give a nod to that. I know there are some questions coming in the chat, and I want to make sure that we save some time for that. But I also want to just segue into some of those by coming back to this question of the barriers, what you see, because knowledge gaps was also mentioned as a big potential shifting point when there is enough knowledge to enter into these complex systems. What else do you think we need to be maybe urgently addressing in order to help more farmers be ready to do these things that make so much sense in so many ways?
Well, I can try my hand at that that really important question of what can we urgently do to address, and also say what I don't think we need, which is an answer to, or a response, I should say, to David's really great question in the chat of, is there any merit in CRISPR gene editing to make crops more drought resistant, for example, and with bigger roots, more soil nutrition? That sounds like part one question. And then is there any oversight / testing for safety to consumers? So this is an area that I feel very strongly about, in that often there is a lot of investment in genetic engineering and the use of technology and what we would call biotech or ag tech to, in the name of feeding people and in the name of increasing drought resistance. Where I take issue with it is that these are copyrighted traits. This is not something that is publicly available information. I think genetic breeding has always and will always play an important role in the improvement of crops and the improvement. That's how we have ended up with the variety of vegetables and fruits that you can see, and not just vegetables and fruits. Any food crops that we're eating today are not readily found in the wild. They are things that geneticists and crop breeders have bred over hundreds of years to increase yields and make things tastier and increase shelf life, and all sorts of reasons why both farmers and consumers would want to improve crop varieties. So I first want to say I'm not against doing genetic breeding. I think that doing it in a way that's available and open to the public, because I feel like every person not only deserves the right to food, I think that everyone deserves the right to be able to save seed and grow food that they and their families and communities want. And by investing in technologies that are owned by some specific corporations, one of which is, headquartered in, or maybe two of which are headquartered here in St. Louis, where I live, that is problematic, because I really think that the profit motives of those companies are at odds with really, honestly, addressing the true issue of climate change. And the way to, in my opinion, best address how to have crops that are more drought resistant is to actually focus on the health of the soil. It's not that we need to actually develop new technologies and actually have different seeds, again, that are copyrighted and trademarked and owned and can only be bought from certain companies. It's that we need more people to have access to the very, what I would call, appropriate scale technologies that are readily available, with, just having access to clean water and to soil and to land tenure. So if just a fraction of the dollars that are invested in biotech could be instead invested on securing land for people who actually want to grow food for themselves and their community, we wouldn't have food insecurity. We wouldn't have climate change to the degree that we have. I mean, I just get really passionate about this subject, because I think a lot of the injustices in our food system come back to who owns the means to growing the food. And I think that it needs to be publicly available.
And going back to what you said, sometimes a problem, if it is perpetuated, it benefits some people. And as you said, if we resolve the situation by creating better soil health, better environment, some of those problems will, creating the need to create a drought-resistant crop, will reduce. I'm not saying it's going to go away altogether. Another thing which is important is many of these technologies, again, I am not against technology, but we don't know what the long-term impacts on human, because at the end of the day, we are talking about our benefit, our health, our planet's health. So we don't know what the long-term impact of these technologies on human health is. I'll give you an unrelated example. World Bank in the 1960s and 70s tried to solve the problem of a lot of waterborne illness in the Gangetic Plain. In Bangladesh and in India, there was diarrhea and cholera. And what they did was they installed like thousands of deep tube wells. So they will go into the aquifer and pump water. After 30 years, those were in arsenic-rich water areas. So that was without any harmful intent. But it took 30 years to figure out what was causing this widespread cancer and all of these health conditions. So these studies, these technologies, BT corn, and I mean, we have had these food in the market for 10, 20 years. Our lifespan is 50, 60, 70 years, 80 years. So the end of the life, what is the impact of these technology on 50 years of exposure? So that is really important. And many of our lifestyle diseases may have something to do with the way we have been farming since industrialization.
Rob, did you want to chime in on that too? It looks like David,
Well,
the person who asked us, yeah.
Yeah, there's so many potential challenges to overcome. You know, again, that could be a very long conversation. I guess I'll start with just a very high level comment, which builds off some things Molly said about taking a holistic perspective, in that I think in agricultural science, and many people have noted this, like other areas of science, we tend to break problems down into their small components. And it's less often that we take what some would call a systems perspective, or that holistic perspective, to look at the bigger picture and say, how do these problems fit together? How do we make an overall set of improvements that lead to the type of results we're trying to get to? So Molly had a good example that soil health may be a fundamentally important aspect of dealing with the droughts or weather issues caused by climate change, even more than any specific technology approach could be. And I would totally agree with that the health of the soil is the key thing that we need to be thinking about. So if we were just strictly saying, okay, what is the most important thing we can do in a lab to solve this issue, we might not come to that answer. And that's why we need that holistic perspective. And we really need farmers' input. I mean, I see farmers innovating faster in a lot of cases than the universities are to come up with solutions to address climate change. And of course, there's no silver bullet. It takes a suite of practices to create resiliency, and it has to evolve and adapt to the conditions that we're facing. But having that broader perspective where we are integrating the human component and trying to have an ecological understanding of the landscape and think about how the system can fit together and be resilient because it has biodiversity in it and has some inherent characteristics like we see in natural systems. That, to me, that's the questions we most need to be asking, are those bigger holistic questions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, there's so much to this. And I think in terms of the time scale, thinking about what needs to be done now or what needs to be done next, the Center for Agroforestry, where I work, has been around now for 25 years. And 25 years ago, we were in a very different situation than we are now. There are so many more farmers, really innovative farmers, who are really willing to take the risk to try some of these things and have the awareness and the knowledge to do it. And I think a lot of that work may have happened in the lab or in the field, these sort of test plots to try to reduce that risk. And some of that is financial risk. Some of that is, just these huge gaps in our understanding of what's going to work where. And given that complexity, there are so many more questions to be asked and to be answered all the time. But we're in a place of, I think, more readiness now, and we're seeing that on the landscape. Places like Earth Dance Farm, where it seems to be working well from a distance. And so I want to, end our conversation before we transition to more questions on a high note. I want to hear about what are some of the successes you're seeing. Maybe that's for those of us who are in a university setting, if you're seeing people who are really succeeding, what some of that looks like, or, for Earth Dance, maybe some of the folks who have been trained through your programs, what they're doing now, and how that plays out in this sort of regenerative agriculture landscape. And then David, we can come back to you afterwards, if that's all right. Thanks.
So I can go first. So I have, because it's easier. So I have been working with several farmers who are willing to adopt these regenerative agricultural practices. And I can give example of a farmer I work with in Warrensburg, Missouri. And he puts trees in his property. He is including silvopasture, and he is surrounded by a lot of corn and soybean productions, and part of their farm effects are bleeding into his property, the pesticides and fertilizers and all of that. So, but still, we need to work with these premier or pioneer individuals who are promoting, because when I talk with him, I mean, he says people go by with the thumbs down from their truck, and we still need to support these people so that again, I mean, these are not impacts that you will see in a day. So if this person can be in his operation for maybe 10 years, 20 years, and then his neighbors will be able to see the impact that he has. Let's say there is a drought like 2012, how his neighbors will be faring versus how his farm will be faring. So that's when his neighbors will be able to see, oh, this is something that works. Even without doing much anything, he will be at a better place compared to those farmers. So as I was going back to the human side, people are often impacted when they feel the impact themselves. So for anything to succeed, unless people see that they are personally impacted, they are less appreciative. I'm not generalizing here, but again, so when I see this is going to help me, so that is a human nature in my view. So when they will see such impacts in terms of their health, in terms of their farming operation, that's what will be important going forward.
Rob or Molly?
Some of the successes. Well, I think one of the things I can speak to is just the literal diversity of folks, like gardens and farms and initiatives that have come out of. We've had over 500 graduates in the St. Louis region who have done our organic farming apprenticeship program. And that's over the last 14 years. This is our 15th season we're going into. And so I think there's people growing at all different scales, everything from a backyard garden to there's somebody starting a new farm down in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. And I will say that one of the things that seems to still be a huge challenge is for farmers to make a full-time living doing this kind of farming. There's a lot of really expensive, capital-intensive needs. So kind of going back to your other question of what do we urgently need to address, I think we need to address urgently how to resource farmers who are interested in doing climate smart agriculture and specifically growing things that are called by the government specialty crops, which literally is almost everything that as humans eating. I mean, there's some commodity crops that we're also eating, of course, like corn and soy and rice and wheat. But anything that is not one of those commodity crops is considered a specialty crop, and we don't get payments from the government to grow X acres of specialty crops like happens in commodity production. And so I think if there's ways we can creatively resource farmers who are wanting to grow the most nutrient dense crops that we're eating, that'll, not only help shift towards more regenerative practices, but it can also help shift the American diet towards something that's actually going to sustain us and regenerate us more in the long run. So yeah, we have, I really need to come up with like just a few specific examples, but the most recent who comes to mind is Jake Smith, who was leading a farm project in St. Louis, Missouri, and Spanish Lake, actually. And he really, developed, to your point, Rob, of like farmers innovating on the ground. They're not beholden to a lot of, universities. I know there's just so many trappings of working for a university that just take longer because of the size of the institution. And farmers often can be really quick to adapt and have to be quick to adapt given weather. And so he's done a lot of innovative farming techniques on a small scale, and was honestly recruited to help lead this new farm project in Cape Girardeau. So that's a really exciting example of him, and it's actually where he's from. So it's also a beautiful story of him like returning to his roots and expanding what he's learned at Earth Dance and then at the farm he was at in St. Louis to take it bigger in Cape Girardeau. There's another alum who's recently on my mind because she just called me today to see if I could go with her to her family land in Kentucky. And she's a female Black farmer and landowner who's based out of Vermont now, but from St. Louis. And she wants to ensure that her family land is stewarded, and she wants help opening doors, and this is the kind of one of the realities of like, I have white skin. I can go in and be treated differently still today in this country for the simple fact of how I look than somebody with darker skin. And so she wants me to go, and I'm happy to do that, to go in solidarity and see what, and I just know more of the farming resources that are available too, since this is what I've been doing for 15 years. So anyways, that is two examples of two of our really amazing alumni, of which, again, there's so many to mention. That's one of the biggest rewards of doing this kind of work, is getting to see so many people beyond our own farm growing in this way.
I feel the same way about the graduates from our Agroforestry Academy, just to see it, those relationships to grow into something really tangible and rooted is so beautiful. So, and I'll put a link to that too. And I put the apprenticeship link in the chat too. So,
but your program is sold out, which is a huge.
It is. I know. We need more. We need more
of this. So awesome. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Rob, did you want to add anything?
Well, we're at the end of our time. I'll just quickly say I put into the chat a link to some of the farmer videos we've made of innovative farmers, particularly those that have row crop operations where they're growing corn or soybeans or raising cattle. Some of the things they're doing. Again, there's many innovative farmers doing other types of crops or livestock as well. But I think those on the call would enjoy seeing some of those. They're mostly short, 3 to 5 minutes, a lot of them. So thanks for having us.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And it looks like Alex mentioned in the chat, if anyone does have lingering questions, you can put those there and we can send them out if our panelists are willing to address any of those beyond this time via email or however. But thank you all for being here and being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. If you're interested in more events, you can watch for them at the Most Policy website and also the climate change website here at WashU. I'll put those in the chat, and the recording will be